Ackerman, the former Watergate prosecutor, says they're probably building the presidential suite at Rikers right now, but a lot of folks think home detention, if anything, might be more likely. I wonder what Danny Karon thinks.
Yeah,
He's come to see us in person here at the table today.
One more opinion. Danny Karon is the founder and owner of Karon Law and a professor at both Michigan and Ohio State law schools. Great to see you here in our Washington, D.C. studio.
Thanks for having me, guys.
I wonder what your opinion is right now about the likelihood that Trump will spend time behind bars and how that potentially could change between now and July 11th. How does his behavior over the course of the next several weeks potentially influence the sentence he'll ultimately receive?
Well, I think it's unlikely he's going to do time in jail. Why? Because it's kind of a low-grade offense. The judge is going to look at such things when determining the sentence as his age, he's kind of old, priors, he has none, whether this was a violent crime, it wasn't. Those militate in favor of probation, not prison. That said, it's Judge Marchand who exclusively is in charge of deciding his sentence. So the last thing Trump wants to do is irritate him, is upset him, is get all over him in these press conferences, including the one that he gave at Trump Tower immediately after the verdict, which, boy, rule number one, and they don't teach you this in law school, but you learn it in life. Don't get on top of the guy who decides your sentence. It's a terrible, terrible tactic.
That said, is home detention considered incarceration?
He could be,
he could be,
sure.
But that's still incarceration if you can't leave your house, right?
Well, if you
does that have to be prison?
No, it doesn't have to be prison.
Okay.
Probation could be just being supervised. It could be home incarceration. It could be prison. There's a scale. It's graded based on those factors that I just described.
So when he sits down with his probation officer, we talked about this for a minute last week, to think of, these are the moments he's going to have to endure, whether there's jail or not. How important is that interview in the outcome here?
Boy, you want to cooperate. You want to cooperate with your probation officer, because between now and sentencing, he's got to meet with this person. The probation officer prepares what's called a pre-sentence report that takes into account the different things we talked about, including contrition. And if he's as resolute and defiant as he's been, and as he likely will be at the sentencing hearing, I can't fathom he falls on his sword at the sentencing hearing and says, you know what, mea culpa, my fault, give me a break, Judge. It could be a bad day made worse on account of his attitude from verdict through sentencing.
What can he do, or more specifically, what is Trump not allowed to do now that he's a convicted but not yet sentenced felon? Are there limits on the things that he can do, the ways that he can conduct himself?
Well, the limit that remains in place is the gag order. He's still subject to it because the court still has jurisdiction over this matter. So what's important to keep in mind is that the gag order applies to the jurors and it applies to court personnel. It doesn't apply to the judge, which is why he was able to say what he did. That said, is it going to work against him come sentencing time? If I'm the judge, I think it might, because judges are human. I mean, they're affected by and subject to the same sorts of whims and attitudes that the rest of us are. Somebody gets all over your case and you're in charge of deciding their fate, you're going to hold it into account and take it into account.
What will his probation officer require of him beyond that meeting, that interview? Will there be multiple meetings between now and July 11th? Will Donald Trump's lifestyle be impacted in any way?
Well, it shouldn't be impacted. In fact, a question I often hear is he restricted from travel? He's not.
Okay.
That could change. If Judge Marchand doesn't like what he hears, the judge is always able to change the contours of the time between the verdict and the sentencing. But for now, he's got to meet with the probation officer. He's got to participate in the preparation of the pre-sentence report. His lawyers are going to prepare motions suggesting a modest sentence at the same time as the prosecution's lawyers are going to prepare motions proposing a harsher sentence. It all goes into the total mix, and Judge Marchand will decide what the sentence is going to be on July 11th. I
have one quick question. You might not have the answer to this, but there's some confusion over whether Donald Trump, as a convicted felon, could vote for himself. And in Florida, apparently the rule allows, and I was just looking at this, it allows the person to abide by the state in which they were convicted. So Donald Trump, because New York is more liberal in this case, could vote for himself in Florida because this case was in New York. Is that how you understand it?
That's absolutely right. You took the answer. We had to switch chairs.
I doubt that.
There's reciprocity involved in this process, so that if you're convicted in Florida, I beg your pardon, if you're convicted in New York, yet you're a Florida resident, if you can vote as a non-jailed felon in Florida, which you can, that rule transfers to New York, and he can vote. I had that backwards. It transfers to Florida, and he can vote in Florida.
It's very confusing, but non-jailed is the key there. If he ultimately is jailed, then perhaps the vote ability goes away.
That's right.
Okay.
If you're jailed, that's a problem. If you're not in jail, then you still have the right to vote in Florida.
This is really important, Kelly. That means we're going to see the cameras follow him into a voting booth at some point, or I guess he's going to probably vote in advance, but we'll do so in the state of Florida.
Unless that is he's jailed, which is still a possibility.
Yeah.
Which is a possibility, and we'll find out on July 11th. There's another case we want to ask you about, Danny, and the trial, in fact, began today. Hunter Biden, the son of President Biden, is on trial in Delaware. Jury selection underway today for 3 criminal counts, allegedly buying a gun and lying about his addiction to crack cocaine. Have you looked at this case? How strong is this case that was brought against him? Do you expect that it will be easy for the prosecution to ultimately end up with a conviction here?
I have looked at it. I think it's a strong case, and I think Hunter Biden's goose is cooked. The issue is, did he knowingly purchase a firearm while an abuser or user of a controlled substance? He was an abuser and a user. He bought the gun in 2019. He was already an abuser and user, as chronicled in his memoir, Beautiful Things, and on his laptop. Everyone knows it. That's why, in defense, his team of lawyers is going to say, hey, listen, he needs to have thought he was an abuser and user, and he thought he was clean. It's a subjective standard. Prosecution will say, no, it's not. It's an objective standard. We all know what we see. He ought to be convicted. That's where all the action and traction will be in that trial.
Recalling there was a plea deal at one point. It didn't live for very long.
No, it
I'm
didn't.
assuming that's not going to happen again.
Oh, no, that ship has sailed.
Yeah.
What happened with the plea deal was that it was going to be a plea for 2 misdemeanor tax offenses, 2 years of probation, toss up the felony gun charge. Under rigorous questioning by Judge Norica, both sides confessed that they didn't really understand each other. They didn't have a meeting of the minds as it concerned the plea deal. She said, go back, do more briefing, come back with a better deal that makes consistent sense. And by then, the Biden team said, you know, forget about it. We're just going to stick to it and not take the plea.
Okay, so you don't see high prospect for another plea deal coming out of this.
No.
You do, though, see a high prospect for a conviction if you think his goose is cooked. The DOJ says the maximum sentence for these crimes is 25 years in prison. Will we see the president's son be spending time behind bars?
It's possible, because you'll remember, as it concerns Trump, the judge considers priors, age, the gravity of the offense. Those aren't real factors in the Trump space. They are in the Biden space, because he's a known abuser. He's a user. He's had his share of problems. Those could enter into the mix that the judge considers come sentencing, because she's exclusively going to decide the sentence, like Judge Marchand is exclusively deciding his sentence. Will it be 25 years for a kind of a nothing, never mind offense? I tend to doubt it. It's pretty low stakes. But you know what? Those are factors that she's easily going to consider.
We talk about priors. And the fact that Donald Trump does not have one is going to play into his sentencing, I think you've indicated. If there is, in fact, a January 6th trial, if the Supreme Court rules Jack Smith's trial takes place, is that New York case now a prior suddenly for Donald Trump?
It is. Under Rule 609 of the Federal Rules of Evidence, past conduct related to lying and untruthfulness, like felony convictions, is admissible in evidence.
Wow.
It's not admissible to prove guilt. It's admissible to impeach. So that's definitely this New York case. It's definitely going to come in to the other federal cases, and perhaps even the state case in Georgia, if it ever gets back on track.
Well, if is the operative word there, not just in Georgia, but here in Washington and Florida in the documents case as well. Realistically, even if we were to get a decision today from the Supreme Court on presidential immunity that allowed the judge here, Tanya Chutkan, to set a trial date, can that realistically happen and complete before the election, or are we running out of time here?
Boy, these judges can do whatever they'd like. If she wants to fast track it, she'll fast track it. If she thinks it can't feasibly be done, she won't. If she fast tracks it, the Trump team can throw up more delays. I mean, that's their playbook. They delay and delay and delay. And that's why this case in New York took so long and resolved so close to the convention, because his team tried to delay it and was successful in delaying it. So anything could happen. Do I realistically think it'll get tried before the election? No, I don't.
I've got to ask you about Donald Trump's message to the Supreme Court over the weekend. As we anticipate sentencing, he wants the high court to get involved. with a message online on Truth Social, quote, "The sentencing for not having done anything wrong will be conveniently for the fascists 4 days before the RNC." He talks about, in this case, the Soros-backed DA, as we've seen before, highly conflicted, ending with the United States Supreme Court, in all caps, must decide.
No, it mustn't decide.
Okay.
That's not how it works. The next step, which is the step they're involved in, is to go to the appellate court. If that loses, they go to the Court of Appeals in New York, which is the New York Supreme Court. They call it the Court of Appeals in New York, which is contrary to what we hear in other states. If Trump loses there, he can petition for certiorari. It's called to the U.S. Supreme Court. Will the Supreme Court take this case? They don't tend to take these types of cases, but considering it involves Trump and they've taken every other Trump case, they might take it. It's not that they must take it. They might take it.
How long would it take, though, to go through all of those other courts before it would reach the Supreme Court? What timeline realistically?
That's 3 levels. We're talking easily a year, a couple years. It takes forever.
Okay. So not something that would be resolved by election time or even inauguration time.
Not even close.
There you go.
Danny, thank you for coming to talk to us.
It was such a pleasure.
Come see us.